Okay. Mr. Porges, what were the historical and professional conditions which led the theorize what would have been the polyvagal theory?
The historical ones were that people thought that the parasympathetic nervous system and the vagal regulation of the autonomic nervous system were primarily and literally solely positive attributes that was not part of a defense system. And so that thinking of the parasympathetic nervous system and a vagal pathway as creating a shutting down response, an immobilization defense response, was not in the conceptualization of many people who dealt with behavior, trauma, and the autonomic nervous system. However, in working with newborn babies and preterm babies, which I was doing, it was quite clear that the slowing of heart rate was a health risk. It was something called bradycardia and apnea, where babies would slow their heart rate and stop breathing. And this was a real risk factor for preterm babies. So the historical fact was that was understood because in the human being, you can see the maturation of vagal pathways, and what you have are two vagal pathways, a very ancient, evolutionarily old vagal pathway that has the capacity not merely to support homeostatic function, but to literally shut down your metabolic resources, just like a reptile would do to hold its breath when it went underwater out of fear. And so this immobilization defense was our historical or evolutionary heritage, except most people in the area of autonomic physiology and in stress physiology thought of only the sympathetics as a defense system. So they saw fight-flight as the major component and stress related to fight-flight. But polyvagal theory articulated that there was an older autonomic circuit that was vagal, but could be recruited in defense. And that was literally our last resort. So when fight-flight doesn't get us out of danger, our bodies shut down and try to conserve whatever resource we have. It tries to appear, the body tries to appear to be lifeless so that predators will leave it alone. And in the state of shutting down, the human would actually dissociate and potentially pass out and not feel pain from a predator. So that's the historical component.
Which difficult have you find in your research work?
Which difficult?
Yeah, if you found.
Oh, what has been difficult in the research?
Yeah.
So by posing unique questions, you actually force scientists to start thinking about the paradigms, the experimental paradigms that they use. And so to kind of document some of these features in autonomic regulation, it's very difficult to use traditional neural blockade studies or surgical studies, because the neural blockade of one pathway of the vagus blocks out both pathways. So it's very hard to separate the two. Similarly, if you do surgical manipulations and cut the vagus, you're cutting both pathways. So the type of paradigm necessary to see this, to see how the two vagal circuits work, require challenges to the nervous system that get it to respond in these different ways, and to try to explain that from a neurophysiological level. So the point I'm really trying to emphasize is that the paradigms that have been used in electrophysiology and neurophysiology are not compatible with trying to separate the nuances of how the system works. And so we see the system reorganizing itself behaviorally in clinical settings, but when we try to do the neuroanatomical manipulations, it's very difficult to provide the documentation that one would love to see in terms of the separation of the two vagal pathways.
What impact did it in the academic world?
One more time, please.
What impact did
in
the academic world?
What impact has polyvagal had in the
academic world? Yeah,
that's easily seen by just going into Google Scholar, which is really the way of finding out how other people, other scientists have utilized ideas. And all you need to do is put in the word polyvagal, and you get several thousand, perhaps over 10,000 citations in peer-reviewed journals crossing many, many disciplines. So polyvagal theory has not really impacted on the mental health world. It's impacted on areas that are in pediatrics, anesthesiology, ergonomics, human factors engineering. It's even moving into areas of that we would find very unusual, like philosophy, and where people are trying to understand the social network of people and using polyvagal theory as a way of understanding it. There's an interest in this notion of polarization of people, whether people support each other or are antagonistic, and now polyvagal theory is starting to be pulled into that understanding, because polyvagal theory brings with it this emphasis that physiological state affects how people interact with each other. And this shifts it out of the behavioral model. And polyvagal theory is also entering into educational models, which have been totally focused on behavioral manipulation, meaning rewards and punishments, and with little respect for the individual's bodily state.
How does the vagal circuit in normal mode work?
Well, I mean, that's many people's lifetimes of work. And when we say normal mode, what do we mean by that? Do we mean that when in most of the situations, the vagal circuit works in normal modes? It's just those normal modes have different adaptive function. So if our nervous system detects features in the environment that are safe, and so that we are actually able to co-regulate with another human being and feel calm, then the vagal circuit is extraordinarily protective. It enables the rest of the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic part of the autonomic nervous system, and also that older unmyelinated vagal circuit that goes below the diaphragm, enables those circuits to work in homeostatic function to support health, growth, and restoration. And that was, in a sense, the doctrine, or I would say myth, of how the parasympathetic nervous system worked. It was really a circuit of health, growth, and restoration. But that is really when that new ventral vagal circuit is working. When it doesn't work, then the rest of the autonomic nervous system becomes vulnerable for defense. And defense, when we utilize sympathetic nervous system for defense, we either call it fight, flight, or we say we're stressed or anxious. But if we utilize the subdiaphragmatic, the shutting down, the last resort system as defense, we are dissociated or we're depressed and we have lost purpose in life. It's because what polyvagal theory provides is an understanding that those three circuits form a hierarchy of function. And it's only when the newer circuit, the newer myelinated vagus that deals with primarily organs above the diaphragm and is linked to the neuroregulation of the muscles of the face and head, that our nervous system is really a nervous system of social engagement and co-regulation.
What role does it play in explaining what happened after the trauma, both psychophysical and behavioral?
Okay. Well, first of all, what polyvagal theory provides, it explains that the consequences of life threat, which we associate with severe trauma, is both a physical consequence and a psychological or mental, but not separated, because polyvagal theory links the two together. So what happens is that the neuroregulation of the autonomic nervous system, meaning the brain's control of our autonomic nervous system, says you're not safe, the body isn't safe. That means that social engagement, that safe component, which tells the rest of the autonomic nervous system to support health, growth, and restoration, is turned off. Now the body is in a state of defensiveness 100% of the time. And for those who are relatively successful in adapting following severe trauma, they are hypervigilant and defensive. But some, that's because the sympathetic nervous system has functionally saved them. And as long as they keep moving with the sympathetics, they're no longer vulnerable to shut down or fall into a set of basically feeling like they're dead. They're falling into an abyss. But if they fall into that abyss, which many people who experience severe trauma have, then they have a whole other set of comorbid disorders. Many of the disorders are physical disorders of the gut. So they might have irritable bowel syndrome, they might have gut pain. The feedback from not having good neural regulation of the autonomic nervous system may result in fibromyalgia and other autonomic anomalies that get clustered together as dysautonomia. And if they maintain this fight, flight, or keep themselves mobilized, then they end up with disorders of the cardiovascular system. So they get, because they're no longer able to allow that system to function in a hierarchical way. But most people who experience severe trauma will oscillate from this mobilization. As long as I keep moving, nothing will happen to me, and then to a shutting down, where they are now visualizing being a victim, and when they are mobilized, they are aggressive. But what that does autonomically, it oscillates things in the gut. The gut is the mirror. It's actually the portal to see what's going on. The gut, they become constipated, meaning that their digestive systems freeze and stop working. And then they cycle into, let's say, diarrhea, where the gut just opens up. And that often gets a label called irritable bowel syndrome, which is a common comorbid diagnostic feature of people who have experienced trauma. It doesn't mean it's a marker for trauma. It just says that this is a way in which people can experience irritable bowel is through the body's attempts to adapt following trauma. But I want to really emphasize that there are other pathways too through which you get irritable bowel. So it's not a one-to-one with trauma, but experiencing trauma triggers a reorganization of autonomic function, and that leads to an array of anomalies in autonomic functions or atypical autonomic function.
What the contribution that the polyvagal theory can do to the psychotherapist? Okay,
for the understanding of what polyvagal theory gives to clinical sciences, it's two parts of it. One, it's the understanding of the therapists themselves in the interaction. They're understanding how triggers from their clients affect their physiology, but also how their physiology affects the facial features, the intonation of their voice that they're giving to the clients. So it really gives the therapist an understanding of the power of physiological state in the therapeutic interaction, and in being therapeutically present and in witnessing the client. In a few words, what I think it really does is it enables the therapist to see the documentary of the human experience, not in terms of events, but in terms of feelings that have a clearly defined and measurable physiological substrate. So where it makes the therapist more present, because the therapist is now asking and talking about the feelings of the client's body and not the event.
In your opinion, what are the main changes in the clinical approach to patients suggested by the polyvagal theory?
The effects on therapy have been, I think, this awareness of the client's physiological state. And the therapists who have heard or read my work, heard me talk or read my work, now are more attuned to what's going on in their clients. They get this information of physiological state, not by putting electrodes on the client and having physiological monitors, but they're seeing it in the intonation of voice and in the facial expression and in the muscle tone of their clients. So they're seeing how physiological state gets manifested in the behavior and cues of their clients. So the theory gives the therapist, especially the intuitive master therapist, it gives them a neurophysiological backing of what they've always known was important. So they've known from the way people speak, their voices, and the facial expressivity, especially the neural tone to the upper part of the face, as conveying whether the person was moving along, was present with the therapist.
In your opinion, is it possible to imagine specific alteration for different disorders, for example, anxiety disorder, mood disorder, and PTSD? Do we already have indication to this effect?
So the first thing is polyvagal theory doesn't gravitate towards specific diagnosis. Polyvagal theory really works on the concept that the brainstem is doing regulation of physiological and behavioral state. And then higher cortical areas start to have emergent properties. And if we're in physiological states that are characterized by lack of safety and defense, then the higher brain structures start organizing in different ways, and they tend to be often emergent properties of not having the information from the brainstem, keeping them literally grounded to the body. So the issue is that polyvagal theory takes an optimistic and parsimonious point of view. It really says that for many of the disorders, there are common underlying substrates of physiological state dysregulation, and treatment could start from a different perspective. It could start from not dealing with the complexity of and specificity of the mental disorder, but going from the issue of can physiological state be regulated. So it asks the question, if physiological state and the emotional regulation and behavioral regulation could be dealt with, what would happen to the other features of clinical disorders?
For you, the polyvagal theory suggests a change of approach in emergency situation, in emergency service, and what the change?
Okay, that's actually an excellent question, because it means that when the body is in a state of fear or danger, what is the responsibility of the clinician? Whether the clinician is in emergency medicine or psychologist or some other support staff, a nurse. And the answer is the body requests, when it gets into states of fear, it requests cues of safety, which are calm voices, engagement, gentleness. We want to be reassured that we're in good hands of someone else. Unfortunately, much of emergency medicine has been about events, doing things to the person. And now we start seeing that emergency medical procedures may be spectacular in preserving life, but they may be powerful traumatic cues. So that people may be suffering trauma from medical procedures, even though the intention of the medical procedure is admirable, something very positive. And in a way, our body doesn't know the difference between a medical emergency and being physically abused, or let's say raped. Something's happening to our body and we don't welcome it. So emergency support staff has to work with the individual so the individual feels safe enough to collaborate, so meaning that the nervous system welcomes medical intervention and is not fearful of it. We know enough that from research to know that when we're scared, the actual surgical procedures take longer to heal. So social support facilitates healing, but having positive visualization also minimizes scarring and makes surgery and medical interventions less traumatic to the individual.
The last question. What research perspective open for the future?
Well, the research perspective, the most necessary research in terms of the theory, is to have a better understanding of the autonomic responses that occur with dissociation and shutting down. A lot of times there's great confusion in the clinical world between terms like freezing and collapsing. So, and they may be hybrid physiological states where there is this dorsal shutting down in part of the body, but there's still muscle tone, meaning that there's still a sympathetic component. And this may be the body's adaptation to keep themselves out of a total collapse, because a total collapse is potentially dying. It's lethal. It's potentially lethal. So there may be these very complex adaptations in which different neural circuits start to blend together as the body tries to, in a sense, protect itself. That, I think, needs a lot of research. The other part where research, I really welcome research, and I think this is where most of it will go, is in understanding that there are multiple portals into calming the physiology, into enabling the individual to feel safe, to making the individual feel witnessed, and the therapist being present with the client. And there are things that we can teach clients to help regulate their state. There are ways of breathing where we can increase the vagal regulation of the heart through slow exhalations. And as we do that, we start getting, the client becomes more available. But it also means that therapists now have a tool that when they feel that they're overly stressed, they can get their body into a state that is now giving cues to the client that the client will feel safe. The other one is understanding the power and the importance in the history of humanity, actually the history of all mammals, of vocalizations, because mammals vocalized, and it was the mammals' ability to vocalize that conveyed their physiological state to others of their species. It enabled, in a sense, a individual of the species to know that the other was safe to come close to. And in a therapeutic setting, it's the same thing. If the voice of the therapist has modulation, intonation, then the body of the client starts to relax. And this is how trust evolves. And trust becomes an important basis in the therapeutic setting. So the underlying, though I would say one of the most important points, is that polyvagal theory provides literally a roadmap to both being present with your clients and an ability to witness them.
Thank you so much. Sorry for my English and I don't know if the connection are okay, but
connection is good. I see.
my English no.
I didn't say that yet. Connection's good. Your English is charming.
Yeah.
And so the important point is that polyvagal theory directs us into thinking more about physiological state, and less about the words people are saying, and more about the intonation, more about the gestures, more about how in their body they are either retaining the stresses or defensiveness, or they're now opening up and relaxing. So in our language, we have all the metaphors: being present, being grounded, being available. So polyvagal theory can really say, gives us a neurophysiological explanation of accessibility of a human-to-human interaction versus the defensiveness of human-to-human interaction.
Thank you for the extra answer.
You're quite welcome. Okay.